to somewhat ominous readings today. Ominous tidings, and then all of that on the heels of what happened yesterday in Pennsylvania. And I had been, of course, wanting to tell you all of our trip to New York. I mean, that was the highlight of summer. And I think I'm going to stick with that. I rewrote most of this stuff while the news broadcast was on last night. And so, at any rate, that's what we have for today. But I'd like to start probably about a month ago now. I was at our service at Green Country Village. And one of my friends comes up to me before we start the service, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you really going to take our children to New York City? That doesn't seem like a very good or very safe idea. Does it?" The apprehension in her face was matched by sort of this nervous wringing of her hands. I saw her again on Thursday, and with it, a visible sigh of relief that sort of emanated from the very center of her gravity, seeing that I was there and that I was a symbol that the entire group had made it back from New York safely. Since then, the question of almost everybody I've encountered about New York has been, well, just one word, right? But my favorite has to be, in 10 words or less, tell me about your trip. And before I catch myself saying something like, "It was amazing," "It was just so fabulous," a different word I've been surprised has sort of arisen within me, and that word is different. Different always seems to come out first, and different in this case doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative. But to my friend's point, I guess I get why she asked me those questions. Statistics that deal with poverty, crime, homelessness, and other societal data are not very favorable for New York City. I get it. But it was knowing all of that and still deciding to go ahead and go on the trip that seemed to fail their risk assessment. Gotham, it seemed, with its almost 9 million people, was poised to swallow us whole. But, I thought, what my friend didn't know, and what New York City certainly did not know, is that I had Jen McIver. I had Tom Droge. I had the Roper clan, the Riles, and I had Blair Ellis. They were coming along for the ride. St. Luke's was covered well, and when we roll deep. While we were there, we stayed at the New York School for Urban Ministry, whose mission remains to equip and train short-term mission teams from churches, Bible schools, mission organizations, colleges and universities. It trains them to minister to the needs of the inner-city population of New York, and they do this well. Every year, approximately 5,000 people are trained at what we came to know as NISM in evangelism and mission. And after having visited the school and participated in some of their programs, or participating in some of their programs, they claim that about 80% of the people who go through that end up going back to their hometown and starting similar ministries, similar outreaches. Rookie groups like ours learned inner city ministry through sort of this cross-cultural, hands-on project of urban compassion. And we did this in one of the largest Section 8 housing developments in our nation. We worked with a church plant called Soul Cry, who was seeking to establish a presence in the local parks that were interspersed between these large tenement buildings. Surrounding us, in just a few city blocks, tens of thousands of people called those towers home. There amongst the high-rises, we learned that over 700 languages were spoken, making our small group one voice in one of the most densely and diverse populations in our country. After living through that experience of traveling and doing mission in the Big Apple, stories about Paul's missionary efforts across Asia Minor seem a somewhat apt segue to speak about the beginning of the letter of Ephesus that we get today in our lectionary. Ephesus was a major city too, a very important hub of early Christianity. It was home to one of the ancient wonders of the world. And of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, Ephesus held a certain strategic significance within the region, much like New York commands in the Atlantic. It was to the church within the city, the polis of Ephesus, that Paul wrote one of his letters from Rome. And it boasts some of the best distillations of his theology, other than the letter to Rome itself. Interesting to note that one of our instructors at NYSUM was named Paul. And before we headed out to our station in Queens, he asked us what we thought of when we heard the word evangelism. And while sharing the good news, you'll be proud to know, while sharing the good news was certainly among the answers, someone also said that it was akin to having a root canal. And some of us laughed, right? Because I think it cuts pretty close. It cuts pretty close because the Episcopal Church is not necessarily known for its missionary prowess, even though the legal name of our church is rendered thus: the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. But at any rate, there you have it. We were there, nevertheless, with new ideas to us, ancient ones, of course, standing before a man who had been in urban ministry his entire life, most of his adult life, teaching us about how we were called to do the work of evangelism too. And despite the heat, God opened a way for us to meet people, and through small gestures of kindness and compassion, whether it was a kind word on the street, a hot dog, a cup of lemonade, some of the kids painted little kids' faces, Daisy delivered reading glasses, right? Some of the kids went around and talked to folks, prayer. These small gestures of kindness and compassion, the city, which seemed so big, so noisy, so indifferent up to that point, opened up to us, opened up before us through its people. And our young disciples, in their own way, responded to that need with hope. My takeaway from that experience is that you can't fit 25 people into a restaurant in New York City. No. My takeaway from that experience, and I think my friends who help chaperone will agree with this, is that as nice as it would be to have St. Luke's own food truck, just throwing that out there, I would take 12 Episcopalians, timid as we might be, out into the big, scary world with nothing in our pockets to offer except our hearts. Because I think in some way, this community, through its love and life together, in some way we know how to earn the trust of people who hunger not just to hear the gospel, but to see it in action through the compassion of self-giving service. Service goes hand in hand with evangelism, you see. Not only that, but I don't think we necessarily need to travel to New York to find the mission field. It's right here in Bartlesville, honestly. And after listening to Paul, right, both the Paul from Tarsus and the Paul from Queens, we don't need specialized training to do this kind of ministry. In some ways, we've already been prepared. We are ready. We are ready if we can listen. We are ready if we can reflect. And when it's time, respond to those who are before us with words of grace and love, which when you think about it, God has already given you through your adoption in Jesus Christ. I mean, that's what it says in Ephesians this morning. In Ephesians, Paul goes on to say that it is by grace that we have been saved through faith. And sharing that kind of love, sharing grace, I mean, sharing grace, giving grace, accepting grace, might just earn us the question that is at the heart of evangelism. Will you tell me more? I think it's at that point that we need to be ready, as Peter says, to always have an account of the hope that is within us. And as I mentioned, I was writing this last night when the newscast was on, thinking about what we might need to hear today or experience today that might offer us some solace in the face of shock. And so I needed an image. And then this image that came to me was a picture that Blair took when we went to Rockefeller Center. And I don't know if you know this square, but it kind of goes down. And it was packed, it was over the 4th of July, right? So there were all these people there. And amidst the throng that had gathered was one of our kids, Will Roper. And he had sort of like commandoed his way up on one of these sculptures. It was an orb, right? It was an orb just before that gold figure at the middle of the center. And you could just see him kind of just like realizing where he was, looking at all these buildings, looking around at all these people in this big, bad city. And I couldn't help but notice that kid had a smile on his face, and that written on the orb beneath him was a single word: hope. It is up to us now to do as Paul says, and to set that same hope on Christ.